The morning was calm. Church bells rang. Radios played music. Across America, families sat down for Sunday breakfast, unaware that history was about to break their lives in two. Nearly 8,000 miles away, engines roared to life in the dark. Orders had already been given. There would be no warning, no second chance. By the time the sun rose over Hawaii, smoke would choke the sky, steel would tear through flesh, and the United States would be forced into a war it had tried to avoid. This is the true story of the day America was pulled into World War II. In the years before 1941, the United States did not want another war. The memory of World War I was still fresh. More than 116,000 Americans had died, millions more across Europe. Cities were destroyed. Empires collapsed. When it ended in 1918, Americans promised themselves it would never happen again. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, that promise shaped the nation. The Great Depression hit hard. Jobs vanished. Farms failed. Banks closed. Americans focused on survival at home, not conflicts overseas. When war clouds gathered again in Europe and Asia, most Americans looked away. Congress passed Neutrality Acts. These laws were clear. The United States would not sell weapons to nations at war. It would not loan them money. It would not send soldiers to fight in foreign lands. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the danger growing abroad, but he also knew his people. The country was deeply divided. Many believed Europe's wars were none of America's business. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began in Europe. France fell. Britain stood alone. Nazi Germany spread across the continent. Still, America stayed out. Roosevelt spoke carefully. He warned of threats to democracy. He offered limited aid to Britain through programs like Lend-Lease, but he promised one thing again and again. American boys would not be sent to fight in foreign wars. Across the Pacific Ocean, another war was already raging. Japan had been expanding for years. It invaded Manchuria in 1931, then China in 1937. Cities burned. Civilians were slaughtered. The Japanese Empire needed oil, steel, and resources to fuel its military machine. The United States watched with growing concern. Japan depended heavily on American oil. Without it, their Navy and Air Force would grind to a halt. Roosevelt knew this gave America leverage. In 1940 and 1941, the United States began to apply pressure. First came restrictions on scrap metal exports, then aviation fuel. Finally, in July 1941, the most serious step of all, the United States froze Japanese assets. This effectively cut off Japan's oil supply. For Japan, it was a crisis. Military leaders believed they had only two choices: withdraw from China and abandon their empire, or strike south, seize oil-rich territories in Southeast Asia, and destroy any force that could stop them. That force was the United States Pacific Fleet. It was based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was not meant to be a frontline base. It was a symbol of American power in the Pacific. Battleships lined the harbor. Sailors lived nearby. Aircraft sat neatly arranged on airfields. Many believed the distance from Japan made it safe. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders debated their future. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo faced an impossible decision. Negotiations with the United States dragged on through the fall of 1941. American demands were firm. Japan must leave China. Japan must abandon its expansion. For Japan's military, this was unacceptable. Behind closed doors, plans were made. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, understood America well. He had studied in the United States. He knew its industrial power. He warned that Japan could not win a long war. But if war was coming, Yamamoto believed Japan must strike first. He proposed a bold and dangerous plan: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The goal was simple: cripple the American fleet in one blow, sink the battleships, destroy the aircraft, buy time to seize territory before America could respond. It was a gamble with history. In late November 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers slipped out of home waters. They sailed east across the North Pacific, avoiding shipping lanes. Radio silence was strict. The crews were told nothing of their destination until the last moment. On board were over 350 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Each pilot knew this might be a one-way mission. Back in the United States, warnings existed. Intelligence officers intercepted Japanese communications. Diplomats sensed negotiations were failing. Some believed an attack was coming. But where? The Philippines, Guam, Southeast Asia? Pearl Harbor seemed unlikely. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, arrived quietly. In Hawaii, sailors slept late. Others attended church. Some wrote letters home. The weather was clear. The sea was calm. At 7:48 a.m. local time, the first Japanese planes appeared over Oahu. They came low, fast, painted with red rising suns. Within seconds, bombs fell. The battleship USS Arizona was struck. A massive explosion tore through the ship. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Over 1,100 men were killed instantly. The harbor became chaos. Torpedoes slammed into hulls, ships capsized, sailors dove into oil-covered water as it burned around them. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed before they could take off. Anti-aircraft guns fired wildly. Few hit their targets. In less than 2 hours, the attack was over. 8 American battleships were damaged or sunk. Over 180 aircraft destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Japan lost fewer than 20 planes. The shock was total. News spread first in Hawaii, then across the Pacific, then to the mainland's United States. Radio broadcasts interrupted programs. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Americans listened in disbelief. This was not Europe. This was American soil. President Roosevelt was at the White House when he received the news. At first, reports were confused. An accident? A sabotage? Then the truth became clear. Japan had attacked. That night, Roosevelt worked on a speech. Every word mattered. He knew this moment would define his presidency. It would define the nation. Across America, isolation vanished overnight. Men lined up at recruiting stations. Factories prepared for war production. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into resolve. On December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed Congress. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. He spoke of treachery, of a sudden and deliberate attack. He asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. The chamber was silent. Then the vote was called. Nearly every member stood in favor. America was at war. But as the nation focused on Japan, another danger loomed. Germany and Italy watched closely. Their next move would decide whether this would be a single war in the Pacific or a global fight for survival. And as Roosevelt finished his speech, the world held its breath, waiting to see if America's enemies would strike again. The answer came faster than anyone expected. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in Berlin. He did not hesitate. He did not wait. He declared war on the United States. Italy followed within hours. In a single moment, America was no longer fighting one enemy, it was fighting 3. The war Roosevelt feared and prepared for quietly was now unavoidable. It would be fought across oceans, continents, and skies, and it would demand everything the nation had. For the first time in its history, America faced a true global war. America moved with stunning speed. Congress authorized massive military expansion. The draft, already in place, widened. Millions of men reported for service. Others volunteered. Young Americans who had never left their hometowns were suddenly issued uniforms and serial numbers. Factories that once made cars switched to tanks. Refrigerators became ammunition crates. Typewriters became machine guns. Women filled assembly lines as men went overseas. The nation's economy transformed almost overnight. This became known as the arsenal of democracy. But in December 1941, America was not ready for battle. Its army ranked near the bottom among world powers. Many soldiers trained with wooden rifles. Aircraft production lagged behind. Naval losses at Pearl Harbor left the Pacific Fleet wounded. And Japan was already on the move. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck again. They attacked the Philippines, then an American territory. General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. and Filipino troops there. His air force was destroyed on the ground, just as it had been in Hawaii. Japan swept south through Southeast Asia. Hong Kong fell. Singapore fell. The Dutch East Indies were invaded. Guam and Wake Island were attacked. American forces retreated again and again. The Japanese Empire reached its greatest size in early 1942. For many Americans, the war's opening months were filled with fear. The West Coast prepared for attack. Blackouts were enforced. Coastal defenses were built. Rumors of Japanese submarines offshore. Then came a dark chapter at home. In February 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It allowed the forced relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Over 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, were sent to internment camps. Families lost homes, businesses closed, rights vanished. The nation that claimed to fight for freedom struggled to protect it within its own borders. Overseas, American forces fought to survive. In the Philippines, MacArthur's troops were pushed onto the Bataan Peninsula. Supplies ran out. Disease spread. In April 1942, the remaining forces surrendered. What followed was the Bataan Death March. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march under brutal conditions. Many died from starvation, abuse, or execution. It was one of the first clear signs of how cruel this war would be. In Europe, the situation was no better. Nazi Germany controlled most of the continent. The Soviet Union fought desperately on the Eastern Front. Britain endured constant bombing. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met secretly to plan strategy. They agreed on one hard truth. Germany had to be defeated first. Even as Americans demanded revenge against Japan, Roosevelt committed to a Europe-first strategy. Germany was the greater threat. Japan would be contained while America built strength. Still, the Pacific demanded action. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back. 16 B-25 bombers took off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, they flew toward Japan. The mission was dangerous. The planes were not meant to launch from carriers. The crews knew they would not land safely afterward. They bombed Tokyo and other cities, then continued toward China. The physical damage was small, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan was no longer untouchable. The American people needed that victory, but it came at a cost. Several crews were captured, some were executed, others died in captivity. The war pressed on. In May 1942, American and Japanese fleets clashed in the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft. Ships never saw each other. The battle ended without a clear winner, but Japan was stopped from invading Australia. 1 month later came the turning point, Midway. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned to destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He believed one decisive blow would end American resistance. But American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval communications. They knew the attack was coming. On June 4, 1942, Japanese planes attacked Midway Island. American aircraft carriers waited nearby. In a single morning, American dive bombers found the Japanese fleet. They struck with devastating force. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Japan lost hundreds of experienced pilots it could not replace. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted forever. The war was far from over, but now America was advancing. In Europe, American troops began arriving in large numbers. They landed in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch marked America's first major ground campaign against German forces. The fighting was brutal. American soldiers were inexperienced. German troops were battle-hardened. At Catherine Pass, American forces suffered heavy losses, but they learned, they adapted. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 enemy troops were captured. The Allies then invaded Italy. The Italian government collapsed. Mussolini was removed from power, but German forces continued to fight fiercely. Meanwhile, the air war intensified. American bombers flew missions deep into Germany. Cities were destroyed, factories targeted, casualties mounted. Young men climbed into aircraft knowing they might not return. Some didn't. By 1944, the war reached its most critical stage. On June 6th, Allied forces landed in Normandy. D-Day. Over 150,000 troops stormed the beaches. The fighting was savage. The cost was high, but the invasion succeeded. A second front was opened in Europe. From that moment, Nazi Germany's defeat became inevitable. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign advanced. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Each battle was harder than the last. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians were caught in between. American casualties rose. The closer the Allies moved to Japan, the more intense the resistance became. By 1945, American forces stood at the edge of victory, and at the edge of a terrible decision. Germany collapsed first. In April 1945, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River. Berlin fell soon after. Adolf Hitler was dead. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe was declared. Crowds filled the streets. Church bells rang again. But the war was not over. In the Pacific, Japan still fought. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa revealed the cost of invasion. Tens of thousands died. Kamikaze attacks struck American ships. Civilians were trapped in the fighting. Military planners feared an invasion of Japan would cost millions of lives. President Franklin D. Roosevelt did not live to see the end. He died in April 1945. Harry Truman became president. Soon after, he learned of a secret weapon, the atomic bomb. Developed under the Manhattan Project, it had the power of unimaginable destruction. Truman faced the hardest choice any president had ever made: use the bomb or continue the war. In August 1945, the decision was made. On August 6th, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was total. The human cost was staggering. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over, but everything had changed. America emerged as a global superpower. The world entered the nuclear age. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. And it had all begun on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, a day that still echoes through history, a day that forced America into a war it tried to avoid, a day that changed the world forever.